Dear learners, welcome to this course on understanding human trafficking. This is a Swayam course and I am very happy to see you all here. On the first video on this understanding human trafficking, we have to first define human trafficking. So in this video, I will help you all to define human trafficking so that you understand what is human trafficking. Then only you will be able to create awareness about human trafficking, prevent yourself from being trafficked, and will help the other people in prevention, rehabilitation and reintegration of the trafficked victims in the society. So once we started, I have been telling you that human trafficking is purchase and selling of human beings. So human beings are sold in a market as commodities and purchased in a market as goods. Someone is selling a human being and the other is purchasing that human being. So the economics of demand and supply, there is a demand for a human being and there is a supply of a human being. So this happens in real life. So real life we see that demand and supply for human life is there. So what are the demand factors for trafficking? Cheap labor, bonded labor, tourism, sex trade, for womb, for different organs, for drugs. Then if you need a bride, for illegal activities, for any kind of sports. Then for pornographic websites, for house help or domestic workers, for agriculture laborers, workforce for hazardous employments, as child soldiers, as beggars, etc. So now we see that there is demand for all these things. Where will we get the supply? So the supply is of vulnerable people, who are lured, who are forced, who are abducted, who are tortured, who are bribed, misled, kidnapped or abducted by the traffickers and sold for meeting the demands for money for benefit of the traffickers. So are these traffickers or customers? If I go to a massage parlor for sex trade, is it that I am a trafficker or I am a customer? If I am visiting the pornographic sites, if I want organ, if I want cheap labor, so what am I? Am I a trafficker or a customer? So I am a trafficker because I am violating the law and purchasing and selling human beings in the markets, villages, houses, secluded places, social media platforms. By what? By seeing their physical appearances, their body types, their color, and judging it as per my need. So I just see a human being and think whether it suits my demand. Yes. If yes, then I pay for him. If that does not suit for my demand, I look for another person. So I am not a customer but a trafficker, a violator of law. Then are these people vulnerable or they are working out of their choices? So can anybody work in an hazardous employment? Do you have a thought that the daily trauma, the agony, the pain they face every second is a consent as per the Indian Contract Act? Then for illegal activities under threat, force, coercion, servitude, etc., can we think about a valid consent? The reality is very different, In cases of human trafficking, lot of constitutional rights are violated, lot of human rights are violated, legal rights are also violated every second. So that human being is a victim, a survivor of trafficking and not a criminal. So as a duty of the welfare state, the state has to ensure that the human rights are not violated, the victims and survivors lead a dignified life, and victims are able to rehabilitate, victims are able to reintegrate in the society and lead a meaningful life. So, the purpose of this video is that after seeing this video, you will be able to define human trafficking, you will be able to explain the elements of human trafficking, and you will be able to understand the various contours of human trafficking. So if I talk about definition of the human trafficking, then the protocol to punish, suppress, talks about the definition of human trafficking, and in that if I talk about Article 3, it says women and children, talks about defining human trafficking in persons, that is either you are recruiting the person, you are transporting that person, you are transferring that person, you are harboring that person, or you are receiving that person. By what means? So the means is by threat, by use of force or any other form of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, or of abuse of the power or of the position, of the vulnerability, or of giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. So you have a control of that person and then you give consent for the purpose of exploitation, and exploitation shall include the prostitution or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor, of service, slavery, or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or removal of organ. So if we talk about Article 3 of this protocol, then it defines human trafficking. This is the best definition, internationally accepted definition of human trafficking. So now we will discuss the elements of human trafficking as per the UNODC. So what acts constitute human trafficking? So either you are recruiting a person, you are transporting a person, you are transferring a person, you are harboring a person, or you are receiving that person. And what are the means of trafficking? Threat, force, coercion, fraud, abduction, abuse of power, abuse of vulnerability of that person, and lurement. And what can be the purpose of trafficking? Exploitation, torture, violation of human rights, prostitution and other sexual exploitations, forced and hazardous labor, slavery, illegal activity and employment, begar, organ trade, and beggary. So these are the purposes for which you traffic the person. Then how do you say that we can criminalize the human trafficking? So Article 3 talks about what is human trafficking, and Article 5 talks about that the conduct set out in Article 3 be criminalized in domestic legislation. So domestic legislation, all the state parties have to make human trafficking an offense by passing a legislation, by implementing that act in the state. And it does not mean that the definition of trafficking will be same as per the protocol, but the definition has to be in consonance with the definition of trafficking in persons as mentioned in the protocol. So definition is there, you have to have a law on human trafficking, and then the domestic legal system should give effect to the concepts contained in the protocol. So all the state parties adhere to the protocol. They have to have a national legislation on human trafficking, and exact language is not needed to be produced, but the content, the intention of the protocol needs to be reflected in the local legislation. So this is very important, when you have become a party to the protocol, then you have to have a national legislation also in your country on human trafficking. Then if anybody tries to commit trafficking offences, that should be penalized. Accomplice should also be penalized, and organizing or detecting others to commit trafficking, that should also be penalized. So the national legislation should adopt the broad definition of trafficking prescribed in the protocol. The legislative definition should be dynamic and flexible so as to empower the legislative framework to respond effectively to trafficking, which occurs both across borders and within a country, is for a range of exploitative purposes and not just sexual exploitation. It victimizes children, women and men, and not only women or adults, but also men and children. Takes place with or without the involvement of organized crime groups. Then when I talk about defining human trafficking, then in Indian context, if I talk about a definition on human trafficking, then we do not find any law which defines human trafficking as on date, but we have a bill in the parliament yet to become an act which defines human trafficking. So the current legislation which we have in India is section 2Z of the Goa Children's Act, and the Goa Children's Act 2003 defines child trafficking. So what is child trafficking as per the Goa Children's Act 2003? Child trafficking means the procurement, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of children. So we have already seen the protocol definition, article 3. So same in the Goa Children Act, we say procurement has to be there, transportation has to be there, transfer can be there, harboring or receipt of children legally or illegally within or across borders by means of threat, use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for monetary gain or otherwise. So this is a very good definition on child trafficking, wherein if you procure person, you transport a child, you transfer a child, you harbor a child, or you receive a child legally or illegally within or outside borders. But the means should be threat, use of force, any other form of coercion, abduction, fraud, kidnapping, deception. I abuse my powers, somebody is under my control, so I am trying to lure that person, to force that person to send his child to me. So I am using my power or my position, and somebody's vulnerability is in question. Then if I receive payments on behalf of somebody, or I try to give benefit to the person who is in charge of that vulnerable child, then I will be punished under this act. So this is a very comprehensive definition under the Goa Children's Act 2003 in India. So, what constitutes child trafficking? It can be, procurement, it can be transportation, it can be transferring, it can be harboring, or giving a person who is under my control, or, trying to just abuse my position, my power, and just give that child to some other person. And what are the means? The means are same, it can be threat, it can be use of force, it can be coercion, it can be abduction, it can be, deception, abuse of power, fraud, kidnapping, and the purpose can be monetary gain, illegal purpose, drug addiction. I am trying to use the vulnerability of that person for sale, for bonded labor. So, the purpose can be for pornography, for child labor, for, working as beggars on the street. So, somehow I am going to earn profit. I am going to earn in terms of monetary benefit. Then we have another legislation which is very relevant in the context of, human trafficking laws in India. The Immoral Traffic Prevention Act 1956. This is to be also amended, and very soon, we are just hoping that this act is also amended with, proper consideration of the vulnerability factor and proper involvement of the stakeholders and the victims while amending this legislation. So, under this act, human trafficking is not defined, but prostitution, protective homes, shelter, corrective institutions, trafficking police officer has been defined along with the provisions related to punishment for keeping a brothel home. Then we have Indian Penal Code 1860. This was amended by the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013, and in 2013 section 370 of the Indian Penal Code, which deals with trafficking of persons, and section 370A, which deals with exploitation of trafficked persons, was there. Then section 371 deals with habitual dealing in slaves, and section 372 deals with selling minors for the purpose of prostitution, etc. Section 373 of the Indian Penal Code deals with buying minors for the purpose of prostitution, etc. So, Indian Penal Code was amended by the Amendment Act 2013, and now we find human trafficking reflected. Similarly, under the Crime Records Bureau, we have National Crime Records Bureau, which talks about the offences. So, how many offences are there in India? Data for that is there under the Crime Records Bureau. In that, we have a reflection of human trafficking cases also. Then we talk about the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act 2012. This is a special legislation to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation. It provides precise definition for different forms of sexual abuse, includes, penetrative and non-penetrative sexual assaults and sexual harassment. So, we have these legislations in India, for human trafficking. We have a protocol which defines human trafficking. We have Constitution of India, which talks about dignity and worth of a human being, which talks about fundamental rights, fundamental duties. So, we have lot of legislations. Then we have human rights documents. So, entire human rights documents are there, the state commissions, national human rights commissions are there, but we are not aware what is human trafficking, and sometimes the victims and survivors of human trafficking do not themselves know that they are not criminals, but they are people, who are vulnerable and they have been trafficked. So, we have to talk about in terms of vulnerability, we have to talk about in terms of defining human trafficking in India. So, we should have a comprehensive law, and I hope that very soon we will have a comprehensive law on human trafficking, as the bill is still pending on trafficking. So, as soon as we have a law, we will be able to address the issues of human trafficking much more strictly. Till then, we have Constitution of India, which talks about fundamental rights and directive principles along with fundamental duties. So, in case of any of the violation of fundamental rights, you can go directly to the Supreme Court under Article 32 and under Article 226 to the State High Court. So, for now, now we have just understood the definition of human trafficking, the elements of human trafficking, and very soon, I will be sending you some activities related to human trafficking. Thank you for this session.